Alright, it is finally time to start looking forward to the 2021 NHL expansion draft for the Seattle Kraken. I mean, I've been looking forward to it for quite some time now, but you know what I mean. In this series, I'll be going team by team across the 30 teams that Seattle will be picking from to see what players I think each team might be protecting, and then also, and probably more importantly for Seattle fans, what players are looking like they might be exposed for Seattle to pick from. And although at this point I haven't quite figured out what order I'm going to go in, we're going to start with the Anaheim Ducks. Real quick, if you find yourself enjoying this video at any point and you like to do that kind of thing, the subscribe button can help you out. Now, I had originally hoped that if I waited to start the series until the start of the new year, that we would be partway through the NHL season and have some idea of what teams were going to be buyers and which teams were going to be sellers come the trade deadline. But as it stands, because of, well, you know what's going on in the world, because of all that, the season is not going to start until another couple of weeks from now, so we might as well just get started. So with that in mind, if you are watching this video a few months from now, then things might look a little bit different, but at least as far as Anaheim is concerned, and it's part of the reason I'm doing them early on, I don't think a lot is likely to change over the course of this season as far as how their roster looks. This is very much a franchise that is on the younger end, and over the last few years has certainly been in a rebuilding phase, which definitely shows up in who I think they're likely to protect. I do think that in large part because of the fact that Anaheim is going to want to protect as many players as possible, it's pretty unlikely that they won't go with the 7 forwards, 3 defensemen strategy as far as who they're going to protect. So on the forward end, I have them protecting Adam Henrique, Jacob Silfverberg, Rickard Rakell, Troy Terry, Sam Steele, and Max Jones. I all think are pretty likely to be protected by the Ducks. And then as far as that 7th protected slot, I do think that it's likely to come down to performance over the next year between Isaac Lindstrom and Dayton Heinen. And at the moment, I would lean towards Isaac Lundstrom just because he is a few years younger than Heinen, but Heinen also, with a good year, could very well earn that 7th spot. And when we get to who could be available for Seattle to pick, I will talk about both Heinen and Lundstrom because, again, either one of them I think is just as likely as the other to be available for them come the expansion draft, so we'll give them both a look. As we get to the blue line, I do once again think it's fairly clear who the Ducks are likely to protect here. I'd be very surprised if either Cam Fowler or Hampus Lindholm are available. And then personally, I think that Kevin Shattenkirk is also a pretty likely bet as far as the 3rd defenseman, but Josh Mason is also a look there. And then in goal, I think it's pretty obvious that John Gibson is going to be the protected goaltender unless something drastic happens over the next season. So then as we get to the players that Seattle might be able to pick from, you'll notice that there was one pretty big Duck name that was left off that protection list, and that was longtime captain Ryan Getzlaf. Now I do think that it's pretty likely that he will find himself off the protection list, and it's not because he isn't still producing, but again, this is a team that is very much looking towards the future, which he is likely not a part of. Plus, considering the fact that Getzlaf will be 36 by the time the expansion draft rolls around, I don't think that it's terribly likely that Seattle will be too tempted to pick him, and the Ducks probably will know that. Really, the only way I could see Seattle picking him is if the Ducks re-sign him over the year to another somewhat large contract, at least for one more season, and then Seattle is tempted to pick him to get closer to that minimum amount of salary that they need to have coming out of the expansion draft. But again, if they are struggling to get to that minimum salary required, it's likely because they've decided to go a bit younger with some of their picks in the expansion draft. And if that's the case, I would think that Anaheim is certainly a prime target for some good young talent, and much less likely to be a place that they look for a big salary. And I suppose it is also fair to mention here that even if you are looking to have a bit of a younger roster, you do still probably want at least 1 or 2 older players to give that veteran presence to at least help kind of mentor the younger players along, which Getzlaf would definitely help with. But again, at the age of 36, I don't think he'll be terribly tempting, and if they are looking for a bit of a veteran, there is also Derek Grant, but I just don't think he's a particularly tempting option either. So then at least as forwards are concerned, that leaves 3 more likely options as far as I can tell, which would be Heinen and Lundstrom, who we mentioned before, as well as Sonny Milano. Between the 3, easily the one with the most experience, and as far as I'm concerned, the most accomplished at the NHL level, is Danton Heinen. Having played pretty much the entirety of the last 3 seasons, Heinen has 220 games in the NHL, and in that time has 103 points on 34 goals and 69 assists. And if you're into advanced stats, Heinen's career looks pretty decent there too, with a 52.1 Corsi for percentage, as well as a 12.4 expected plus-minus over his career. Though to be fair, both of those stats do in some way at least reflect the team the player has also been on, and in Heinen's case, he did spend most of the last 3 years in Boston before being acquired by Anaheim in a trade over last season. So you would think that, especially considering the fact the Ducks did just acquire Heinen, and that at the age of 25 he already has pretty much 3 full seasons in the NHL with at least some success, that he would be exactly the type of player that a team like this would be looking to protect. But Heinen also has struggled to show improvement over those 3 seasons, so while he has looked at least like a good potential young player, he hasn't really shown that progress that you would also like to see. Which is a large part of the reason that if he doesn't seem to have taken that next step over the course of this next season with the Ducks, I could see them forgoing protecting him to go with a younger guy like Lindstrom. A 2018 first-round pick, Lindstrom really hasn't played all that much in the NHL to this point with just 30 games in his career, and in that time has just 6 assists with no goals, so he really hasn't shown all that much at the NHL level, but also hasn't had that much of a chance to. He spent most of the last 2 years in the AHL, where he also has kind of struggled to show the amount of points production that you would hope for from a first-round center. So as far as being an NHL talent goes, Lundstrom is very much largely an unknown at this point, and this next season should very much tell the story about how the Ducks feel about him and what he can potentially do at the NHL level if he does play significant time. But again, he is just 21 and is a fairly recent first-round pick, so if you're the Ducks, you probably don't want to be giving up on a guy like that too early, especially considering you're going to need some help at center. Now, I do think that the one of those two that is exposed is probably going to be the best forward option that the Kraken will have. It is worth mentioning that Sonny Milano will also probably be there. At 24, Milano has played at least some of 5 seasons in the NHL with 116 games and 42 points in that time with 20 goals and 22 assists. And while that is a fairly modest point total for a forward, it is still pretty early in his career and he hasn't had too much time in the NHL, plus his advanced stats, if you believe those, would suggest that he's at least a slightly above average player. And while again, Milano is another one of these players the Ducks did just recently trade for, he would have to show quite a bit and have quite a bit of a breakout season in order for him to earn that 7th protected slot on the forward side. And really in the end, if you're Anaheim and Milano is the player you end up losing to Seattle, you probably aren't feeling too bad about that, even if he does have some mid-range potential. Now, when it comes to teams like the Ducks who have struggled over the last few years, it's probably tempting to think that the Kraken probably aren't going to get much of a good player from them. And while that probably is true, at least to some extent, from the perspective of they aren't going to get a first-line forward and they probably won't get a first-pair defenseman, there is still some pretty promising young talent that they could use for building to the future. And when it does come to a team like this that isn't really stacked in either the forwards or the defensemen, and they're protecting 7 forwards and 3 defensemen, usually the better player is going to be found on that defensive side. And I do think that is very much the case here. Now, if Seattle is just looking to take the best player available from each team, regardless of whether or not he's one of the youngest players available, I do think that the Ducks are going to have to expose at least one pretty decent defenseman. And like I said earlier, I do think that barring just a terrible season, Kevin Shattenkirk will probably be protected by the Ducks. But if he is for some reason left unprotected, he would be a pretty decent pickup for the Kraken. But even if they do in fact protect Shattenkirk, that leaves Josh Manson available. At 29, with what will be by the time the expansion draft rolls around over 400 games already under his belt, going into this next season, Manson has 97 career points with 21 goals and 76 assists. But again, you're probably not going to be expecting to get too high scoring of a defenseman, especially from a team like Anaheim. And at least stat-wise, some of his other stats would suggest that he is a pretty decent player with a Corsi for percentage of 51% and a career expected plus-minus of 9.7. Now, probably is also fair to mention that while Manson is likely to be the best, at least stats-wise, player available for the Kraken to take from the Ducks, and most experience, gets laugh aside anyway, he also has had a bit of a down last couple of years, and if he has another off year this year, he might not be quite as tempting of a player for this Kraken to take. And if that does prove to be the case, and assuming the Kraken can get some pretty decent defensemen from elsewhere, which I think is decently likely, they might be more tempted to go with a bit of a younger defenseman from the Ducks like Josh Mahura or Brendan Gooley. Now, neither one has seen a ton of NHL experience to this point, and between the two, Gooley definitely has the more experience with 59 games to Mahura's 28. And as a result, does have more to show for it with 14 career points on 4 goals and 10 assists to Mahura's 9 points on 2 goals and 7 assists. And again, if you tend to be a little bit more into advanced stats, then Gooley has had a little bit better of a career so far to this point, but again, neither of these players have played a ton, so there isn't a whole lot to go from there. As well as the fact that in his 11 games to Gooley's 30 last season, Mahura did have a little bit better production. And in their AHL careers, it's been largely the same story, so if the Kraken do decide to go with one of these younger defensemen, I don't really think there's any definitive way to say that one would be a better pick than the other. Personally, as far as I'm concerned anyway, I do think that Manson, who's the most likely of the two between him and Shattenkirk to be available, is going to be a pretty decent option for the Kraken, but I also do like the idea that if Gooley has a pretty good season, the Kraken could pick him up, getting their starting defenseman somewhere else, and then start Gooley off in the AHL. Now, it is also worth mentioning that straight up picking a player from a team isn't necessarily the only option, and Anaheim is actually one of the teams that Vegas was able to, in most people's eyes, take advantage of in their expansion draft. Because when it came to the Golden Knights, the Ducks traded them prospect Shea Theodore in exchange for taking Clayton Stoner, who at that point, well, his career was done. And of course, with hindsight being 2020, that does not look like it turned out particularly well, especially considering how good Shea Theodore has been for the Golden Knights. So I do think that the Ducks will probably be a little bit gun-shy when it comes to dealing with the Kraken, but this is a team that does like to make some trades, and while they might not be looking to trade any more prospects, they could potentially be looking to trade some draft picks. And while I wouldn't necessarily expect that the Kraken would be able to get a first-round draft pick out of the Ducks, I do think there's a decent chance they might be able to get like a second-round draft pick and maybe some extra in order to take the Ryan Kesler contract, or the last year of the Ryan Kesler contract, off of the Ducks' hands, since this is a team that is going to be fighting the cap, especially with the flat cap for the next year. I mean, they're already a couple of $1 million over the current cap of $81.5 million, and even though they will be able to get a couple of million off of that by re-signing at the very least Getzlaf to a bit of a smaller contract if they do re-sign him at all, it still is going to be a tough hit to have that nearly $7 million of just dead money going to Ryan Kesler. So if the Ducks are looking to potentially make a deal with the Kraken in order to protect some of their younger guys from exposure, then this is a team that we could be looking at getting a draft pick from. But I would definitely love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below. Who do you think the Ducks are most likely to protect, and what player would you like to see the Kraken take from Anaheim? And maybe even if this is a team that the Kraken could pull off a trade with. Otherwise though, that will pretty much do it for my look at the Anaheim Ducks and the upcoming expansion draft. If you have made it to this point in the video, as always, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down there. Otherwise, until next time, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace!